I think we're at that point where we're going to go ahead and get started, being conscious of time and participate. I want to welcome everybody and thank the John Humphrey Center for allowing the Japanese National Association of Japanese Canadians and the Edmonton Japanese community to do a number of presentations during the conference. We've kind of have a theme that runs through our sessions of trying to present information behind the Japanese situation and what happened during the war and post and the types of things that we have been doing as part of the community of activists for human rights. And this session is wonderful because it provides you some practical applications of the Japanese community with Judy Hanazawa, who will be providing some background. I just want to indicate once again that anyone who's interested in comments or questions, please do so within the chat and we'll address those towards the end. And so I'm just going to turn the program over to Judy and allow her to move forward, and we'll deal with questions later on. Judy?
Hi. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Judy Hanazawa. I'm doing the land acknowledgement first, and I know that that the conference is taking place on the Blackfoot Confederacy and Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. I'm speaking from Vancouver and expressing much gratitude and appreciation to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples for being able to live and hear upon their unceded ancestral land. So just a little bit about myself. I'm a Japanese Canadian Sansei, and I descend from Fisher families from Steveston, BC. My family prior to Steveston, before immigration, was from the place in Japan called Miyomura or Mihamacho in Wakayama, Ken, Japan, where there were lots of fishing people. And certainly before the immigration, my family were into fishing as well. So we were interned in Bridge River, and by 47, when I was born, we were in Merritt. Still, we weren't able to return to the coast, but of course, with many others in 1949, my family returned and my dad went back into commercial fishing. So I have 2 children and 2 grandchildren, and I've been a social worker. So I've worked for 15 years before getting redress myself, individual redress, and I was able to go back to school and earn a master's degree in social work. And then I began working with the Squamish Nation. They were wanting to develop their own child and family program run by themselves, and so my job was to help them do that. And I continue to have an association with them today. As they embark on their self-governing own law to run their program. And it's very gratifying that I've had this relationship for such a long time, which almost gets into about 30 years now. So in 1990, I did begin my volunteer work with the Japanese Canadian community. And in that time, I've mainly focused on human rights and anti-racism work. And I'd like to acknowledge the NAJC current Human Rights Committee. I am with Christian Perry from Montreal. Christian and I are co-chairs of the committee now, but our committee members who come from all parts of Canada have all been great contributors to the committee's work. And I'm just going to name them. Misty Kozak, Nina Dubek, Kevin Higa, Connor Hasegawa, Lynn Kobayashi, Terumi Kawada, Kevin Okabe, Marika Omatsu, April Sora, Fumi Torigai, and Sharon Yamashita. So just want to give you that acknowledgement about the great work of our committee currently. So we're going to start off with a film just to give some context to the presentation later. Just a quick run through that after the film, I'll be talking to you along with a PowerPoint presentation. And then we'll conclude with another film, which kind of sums up where the presentation is at. And and then after that, we'll be taking questions and then coming to an end. So I hope you get a lot out of this presentation, and we'll begin now with the film, which is called Perpetual Foreigner. So we'll be seeing you later. Thank you.
Where are you from? No. What I mean is, where are you from? Where are you originally from?
And it's asked over and over again. And it could be like a hamster in a wheel. It's like a wheel I never got off.
It's that sense of, I am not one of you. I am the other person. I don't belong.
For Asian Canadians, being seen as an outsider is part of our reality. We call this the perpetual foreigner stereotype.
When you say the word perpetual foreigner, I think of the word other.
No matter how long you've lived in North America, in Canada, you're always from away.
Never considered part of the fabric of the culture, the society, the country, the government.
Quand même, je crois au Québec, comme aussi à travers le Canada, un racisme systémique qui est ordinaire, qui est aussi simple que justement la question de tu viens d'où, la question de représentativité.
The perpetual foreigner stereotype is the false belief that no matter where you were born or raised, whatever your history, as a visible minority, you will never be fully Canadian.
Because they visibly look different from perhaps the automatic assumption that one may have that Canadians should look like a white person.
Even though that's constructed belonging, right? They actually don't belong here. They were migrants too to this place.
Not only does this completely ignore the history and presence of Canada's Indigenous peoples, but it judges someone's right to belong based on their looks rather than where they were born or their participation or contribution to society. This is a continuation of a long history of exclusion and fear of Asian Canadians, like the labeling of Japanese Canadians in World War II as enemy aliens and spies.
Japanese living in the West Coast, we were a threat to the federal government. The kind of thinking at the time was that the Japanese were going to come and invade Canada.
By the end of the war, 22,000 Japanese Canadians were forcibly relocated and sent to internment camps, with nearly 4,000 of them eventually exiled to Japan, a country that was completely foreign to them. Only after having been wrongly interned did Japanese Canadians get the right to vote in 1949. Similarly, it was only after risking their lives to fight for Canada in World War II that Chinese Canadians were granted full citizenship and the right to vote in 1947. The attitudes that labeled Asian Canadians as second-class citizens still persist to this day.
Regardless of our citizenship, we're also then deemed like not always Canadian, like we're expected to kind of justify our belonging here.
At work, Asians may be seen as being less qualified or competent based on their appearance and accent. Speaking with an accent becomes a hurdle to overcome and gives the false impression of being uneducated and unintelligent.
It would only be when I was an adult did I learn what my father's salary was, and seeing how he was treated at work and how his skill set was diminished was something that we had to process after he was forced into retirement.
Stereotypes will reinforce the belief that Asian people are just good workers.
And the irony is that although they're seen as cheap labor force, many temporary foreign workers are actually educated. They have to take on this work, but many of them actually have education. Like some of them have a post-secondary education. But again, because they're occupying that rung in the economic hierarchy, they're seen as cheap and also disposable labor.
We are here, most Asian communities are here by virtue of taking up places in the economy because slavery was abolished, right? And because we can be deemed as folks who can work for minimum wage, less than humane wages. It's historically grounded, but it's also seen evident in the everyday about who works the menial jobs that no one, the regular white Canadian does not want to work.
During the pandemic, The perpetual foreigner stereotype has contributed to the increase in racist attacks on Asians.
Non! Touche pas! Touche pas, man! Arrête! C'est toi qui m'harcèles!
Tu les as étudiés à 5 ans? Pas comme vous autres, écrire le chinois. Chinese, démocratie. OK? Le Japon aussi. OK? Well, you.
My roommate and I were attacked during broad daylight on the main street in the city of Montreal. A man approached us from behind and started to strangle my roommate. The man was saying something like, "It's your fault." I knew what this was about. And that's exactly why I'm making this video today, is because we have to stop this new hate against Asians.
In the first time in 10 years that I felt like, oh, like I would maybe watch my back a little bit if I had to go out.
Je pense que juste le fait de se poser la question, est-ce que je dois me cacher ou pas, ben, il y a un problème.
How do we put an end to the stereotype of the perpetual foreigner? As a society, we need to put in place more inclusive practices and encourage equity in the workplace.
Workers' rights and human rights, they're intertwined.
This impact of marginalization, not being given equal opportunities, being seen as the other or the foreigner, those are impacts that are significant in our day-to-day life and our ability to contribute to society in the best way to, feel our potential.
Should be working together to collectively and collaboratively address our common concerns because we are actually seeking the same thing, equity and equality for all people.
Education is so important. And, it's a continuing education from both sides. And then, of course, communication, education and then communication, they go hand in hand.
If we don't start the discussion, who will?
I hope that gave you some context, and I do have to acknowledge Act to End Racism for the great work they've been doing, and it's an organization that began because of COVID. So anyway, so we'll go on now, and we're going to go into the PowerPoint presentation that's been prepared for this session today. I'm calling it Human Rights Journey to the Future, and it's about the National Association of Japanese Canadians Human Rights Committee and its connection to the various local work that's been done in some communities across Canada as well. So we'll go ahead now, and could we go into the first slide? So the first slide does go into what was behind, and I think the film gave you some context too, but based on our Japanese Canadian community being destroyed upon the onset of the Second World War and the level of inhumanities perpetuated upon our community, within the 10-year period prior to achieving redress in 1988, there was protest. And this is a scene of a protest that took place at the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. So this was an important achievement. Could we go on to the next slide and the signing of the agreement? The signing of there was success. This was an important achievement, and it was an important achievement related to the actual history of Canada. This was a very significant achievement that Japanese Canadians were able to sign a redress agreement with the government of Canada. But upon achieving redress, there was a sense and very much a very clear message from the NAJC to the community that we needed to be speakers. We needed to present the importance of human rights and that we needed to be vigilant about human rights as a whole community. And so a focus within the organization to provide a human rights committee work was begun following the redress agreement. So could you go on to the next one, please? An outgrowth too of the agreement was the establishment of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And this was something that came of the thinking that what happens to us should never happen to others. The CRF is a federal crown corporation, and it was finally opened as a service and a foundation in 1997. And their commitment today is to fight racism in Canada and to foster cross-cultural understanding. So could we go on to the next one, please? So looking at the importance of human rights work, which was something being very much a position taken by the NAJC after redress, there was an actual bylaw, which is interesting because there was a bylaw created within the NAJC to make sure that human rights work was going to be a prominent part of the organization. So the bylaw said that the vice president of the NAJC will always be the chair of the Human Rights Committee. And I think the thinking there, of course, was to make sure that human rights work was going to happen within the NAJC. So the committee began in 1990, but across the country, there were references to human rights taking place in various communities. And Vancouver actually took on quite a major role in looking at the development of human rights committees within the Japanese Canadian community. And this photo here is of Tatsuo Kage. Tatsuo was heavily involved in the redress movement. He was a campaign supporter. He was a Japanese translator, interpreter, and he assisted during the redress application process. And his commitment to social justice and involvement in redress activated his focus on encouraging human rights awareness and activism among Japanese Canadians. So he figures prominently in the NAJC and in the initial development of the Human Rights Committee. Could you go on to the next one, please? So this was something that the statement here to actively work independently and with others toward the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, related intolerances, and to strive for equal rights and liberties for all persons in Canada, irrespective of and not limited to race, color, creed, national origin, or sex, and to combat discriminatory practice directed against disadvantaged groups. This kind of mission was also adopted within local organizations like the Greater Vancouver Japanese Canadian Citizens Association. The Vancouver Association actually became quite active in their human rights work. And in that activity, they offered some influence upon the national community through the NAJC. So the actual structure of the NAJC Human Rights Committee beginning in 1990 was actually composed of appointed people across the country. There was volunteer appointment as well because, for example, with Vancouver becoming quite active, Tatsuo Kage being sort of a very great kind of a model for the activity, for activism. Vancouver became quite active and so offered their support to other communities and became quite involved in the national community and in the development of the NAJC Human Rights Committee. Other things were done to make sure that there was a framework to the committee's work. And so there was a real drive to ensure that people would join the committee from across the country. And there were actual appointments. And so based on the fact there needed to be these appointments, there needed to be an education process that happened for the National Committee. And so there were various tools that were used in order to educate the committee. So we'll go on to the next one, please. The next slide. Yeah. So the Greater Vancouver JCCA and our Human Rights Committee here in Vancouver developed some handbooks. And these handbooks were important because they gave context and history and also looked at, our struggles as Japanese Canadians, and even in looking at what was the process for Japanese Canadians to really adapt to human rights values and so on. So it gave a good context, and then also gave practical information about what to do when there has been a human rights violation. And it also spoke to new immigrant Japanese Canadians and even Japanese nationals working in Canada about what human rights were and that they had rights in Canada. And they could turn to this handbook for some advice and some guidance about that. So these kinds of tools were used in order to inform the National Committee and then the other local organizations across Canada as well. Okay, so could we go on to the next one? There was a lot of advocacy work happening, a lot out of Vancouver and some taken up in other areas as well. What was needed, though, was that ongoing with the work of actually delivering human rights services, there was an ongoing need to continue to educate the national community about human rights. And in doing that, there was education and orientation happening to our committees. And so we did get involved with presentations regarding Indigenous speakers and looking at their struggles for justice and about the history of other racialized groups. There were presentations by Muslim Canadian speakers about post 9/11 racial profiling and Islamophobia, because at that time, there was quite an intense, feeling against many Muslim communities at the time. Also, there was work about the two-spirit lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender plus community, including members of that community who were also Japanese Canadian. In 2005, the act came into place, which legalized same-sex marriage. And so there was a sense of really looking at what was going on with the lesbian, gay community and what their experience was then. And this was something that was also noted in human rights work in our community. And a difficult one at the time, looking back in the earlier parts between 2020 and 2010, a little bit later, was looking at the experience of community of countries which were affected by Japanese militarism. And so there were advocacy groups that we connected to, which looked at the issues of comfort women and other victims of Imperial Japanese military history and the past atrocities that were committed. This was a difficult one for our community, but it was something that did align with human rights work and human rights values. And so our committees did take on that kind of work as well. And then on a practical level, as I said, we tried to offer guidance for anybody who was in an unfair situation, human rights in the workplace, human rights in daily living issues, violations. And so tools like the guidebook were there to help out. Now this panel here is about letter campaigns. And the letter here is about our recent letter in 2023, which went to government leaders to talk about the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and two-spirit people and their outstanding injustices. And this was something we took on later as the National Association's Human Rights Committee. We've always had an ongoing connection to standing with Indigenous people and their outstanding justice issues, and it's carrying on today, as this letter indicates. Okay, could you go on to the next one? Yeah, so I've outlined issues related to individual advocacy, the Indigenous community. We are reaching out to build more solidarity between Indigenous, Black, and persons of color communities. And now in our national committee, 2 of our members are working to do the work of the CRF Anti-Asian Racism Coalition. It's called the Coalition Against Anti-Asian Racism, and it was established in 2023, so it's very recent. But we have 2 committee members who are quite active with this particular committee. So can you go on to the next one? Yeah, there's been a lot of work as time has gone on. In looking back, when we had this process of appointments to our committee, we were dealing with, I think, some discomfort to some level in our community. I can talk about that later, but I'm just going to point out here as we proceeded into the after 2015 and so on, we could see the shift happening and a lot. And perhaps it was because we had generations growing, but there was a lot of awareness that was developed over that time. And other communities in Canada became quite active relating to human rights work. So, and also because of COVID, as it says here, we began to do partnerships with other organizations and to participate. And ACT to End Racism is one of those organizations. We were active with and remain active with that organization, which had a campaign early on, which was about speaking up. And it was about speaking up about COVID, speaking up against the history of anti-Asian racism that had been part of Canada's history, but also speaking up because the perpetual foreigner matter had come up again, as the film indicated. And there was a need to do that, to understand that it was not only a traumatic experience to experience direct hate, but also the ongoing mental health issues related to that needed to be highlighted as well. And that includes issues like intergenerational trauma. So our Toronto Human Rights Committee, the Toronto National Association of Japanese Canadians, put on a wonderful seminar in October of 2022. And in that seminar, so many issues were addressed. We looked at Indigenous solidarity, our solidarity with the Indigenous community. We looked at intergenerational trauma, mental health needs, youth, and even precarious housing issues. It covered a lot of ground, but it was one of those pivotal moments in our NAJC Human Rights Committee development, which indicated that we had come a ways since 10 years earlier. So could you go on to the next one? So at this point now, we're looking ahead. We're looking ahead locally, as we do here in Vancouver, but also in other areas. I think the conference that is taking place now and the work of the Edmonton Japanese Canadian Association speaks to the development of human rights awareness. Other communities like Toronto, Montreal, Winnipeg, there's a lot of work getting done across the country. In the earlier days, I think being from Vancouver and being so active, I think, and focused in human rights, we honestly felt quite alone in the work that was being done. But there has been much change, and it's something that needs to be applauded. So this panel looks at what some things may have been factors about our behavior, I think, in looking at post-redress human rights work. So the thinking has been, and as my somebody that I really hold my hands up to, Satsuki Ina, who's a Japanese-American psychology professor and activist, who told her own story and said that, as she was growing up, her mom told her she must do her best. She was a child who was told, you must do your best because it is a way to basically be safe from criticism and safe from being othered and safe from being rejected. And I think many people in our community can relate to this. And so this panel indicates that this is something that probably has affected most Asian Canadians and others. But in looking at that struggle to belong in Canada, this has certainly been a strategy that has been handed down in families to say, you have to get your education, you have to do your very best at all times in order to move ahead and have the life that you want to have, but also to belong. So that this I've written down here as a strategy. And at this point now, I see a shift, the strategy to belong as a way to overcome racism, to overcome othering, to overcome the systemic ways that have caused injustice to communities, is shifting so that there is a need now that we're very conscious of, which looks to developing solidarity with other communities. And that is something that the NAJC Human Rights Committee and our local committees is looking at. And again, as this conference is indicating. So could you go on to the next one? I think we're closing up here. We're getting to the end. So I've sort of said this before in other venues, but my thinking now is that more than ever, we need to pull together. I have a friend, Scundle Bernie Williams, who's Indigenous. She's a hereditary chief of the Haida Nation. And in doing workshops with her, she has simply said, we've got to stand together. We need each other. We need to work together to make sure that these threats to our humanity, to work against hate, to work against racism, this is the way. And so as we look at standing together, we need to urge governments to make sure that they have laws that are embedded that truly do effective work against hate and against racism. We're looking at a world which is under a lot of issues happening, of course, as we all know. And in those times of climate change and other threats, there can be a tendency for people to turn against each other. And in this precarious time, and as we want to create a world that is safe and which will allow for children to grow, this can be and should be a way that we really consciously do something to make sure that human rights and the work of the NAJC Human Rights Committee goes in that direction. So the ongoing outreach is extremely important. And I think this is a big message at the end that I wanted to make sure that you received. I know the NAJC Human Rights Committee and local committees would also stand with together on this matter. And I thank you for that. So as a sort of an ending to this message from us, we're going to present another film, which I found to be very powerful, giving the same kind of message. And so I'd like that to happen. And thank you. Can we go ahead with the film, please?
I think he's working on it.
Okay, great.
The first time my grandchild asks, and they will, where were you? A history book will unfold before my eyes. Little spines snapping like a leather belt, some pages yet unwritten, dripping with the blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors who crossed the ocean seeking a dream that turned out to be more like a myth. Where were you? When CPR foremen sent trembling Chinamen with frail fingers into the tunnels with sticks of dynamite, where were you? When head tax and immigration acts shut the door to the motherland, splitting countless Asian families down the middle like steamed pork buns, where were you? When the boat people landed in the dead of winter, promptly pushed to the ghettos like the rest of the rabble, when Nikkei fishing boats were impounded, their nets deemed a threat to wartime security, 22,000 Japanese sent to the mountains to concentrate on all the ways they weren't Canadian enough. The first time my grandchild comes to me with puffy eyes, asking me where I was the first time I got called a chink, asking me why it still hurts this bad in a country that says it welcomes us all, I will be forced to contend with all the times I've kept my head down and pulled my bootstraps up. A history of silence that speaks louder than a Hiroshima bomb. We have never been a loud people, just hardworking. After all, chopsticks and stones can break your bones, but words will never hurt you, right? So study hard, Zai. Don't talk back. We are lucky to be here, to be doctors, lawyers, engineers. Railroads and laundromats, prosperity and graduation caps. They might not love us like they love our food, but they pay our mortgages while we pay our dues. When my grandchild asks, so what did you do? When they knelt on a black man's neck till he died. When they trespassed and attacked First Nations healing camps. When they called it Kung Flu and spit on our grandmas at bus stops. What did you do? And where were you? When Black Canadians paved the way for our emancipation. When local natives pulled our broken bodies from collapsed railroad tunnels and nursed us back to health, bending cedar and weaving bamboo. Did you fight for them when they fought for you? I want to tell them. We tried. We stood. We fought. We could. No longer only doctors, lawyers, engineers, but artists, athletes, allies, activists. Every Chinatown and Little Manila an act of defiance. Every stoic action mistaken for silence. Here we are on the shoulders of humble giants. Their guidance meant survival so that we can now speak, so we can now strive, so we can now struggle, so we can now thrive. When they ask me what I did, I want to tell them, I tried.
Thank you, Kevin, for that. At this point, I don't see any questions, but I do have a couple of questions for Judy, and maybe that will inspire some other questions or comments from the audience. Yes, these videos that Judy has presented are amazing videos, and I think they get the message across in a very quick point of time. I have a couple of questions, Judy, for you. And the first one is that human rights is a huge area to deal with. And I guess I would ask how your committees determine what kinds of things you focus on in order to do your work. And what's your plan over a course of a period of time to work with whatever you're going to work with?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I think what we've found is this ongoing need to make sure that we're standing with the Indigenous community, for one thing, that it's a constant. The need to develop that connected relationship, to stand with issues as they arise, is one critical matter that there's no doubt that across the country, excuse me, there's an awareness about that need to reach out and be connected and to stand with the continuing issues that the Indigenous communities across Canada are still dealing with. Our work also is about making sure we've got these outreaching exercises in our different communities to make sure that we're connected to other Asian Canadian communities. And that still is a work in progress, because we really haven't done a lot of work regarding knowing histories and sharing histories and creating that kind of partnership that we need to have. But as well with the African Canadian communities, we know that there's a need to do some outreach with Muslim and other communities as well. So generally speaking, those are the areas. And as far as our own community, I just wanted to comment that it's been an interesting process, looking at this long-term growth of human rights work within the National Association. Our community, I think, has gone through trauma, as we all know, and our generations now, our younger generations, are pointing out that trauma, and are pointing out the need to address the emotional and the internal consequences of that trauma. But on a sort of a connecting level to human rights, it hasn't been so apparent. And I think that as the younger generations recognize the connection, that human rights and the racism has affected a lot of our community development, the need to sort of succeed, the need to overcome history, the need to be a part of the Canadian establishment. These are all things that our community has really worked hard at accomplishing and should be applauded for that. But at the same time, I think that kind of work as a way to overcome being othered, being those enemy aliens that we were once labeled to be, has taken up a lot of time and attention in our communities and families, understandably. And so it's been, as time has gone on, then younger generations have come forward, that there's been the actual pointing out to things like, I didn't know some of my own family's history because nobody wanted to talk about it. To looking at, these are things that are going on inside people, the mental health consequences. And I think that has highlighted the need to look at actually what can be done to prevent the harm of racism, and what can be done to work with human rights in order to do that prevention work. So those are the things that I think the NAJC Human Rights Committee is aware of and wants to do more work in at this point.
I'm just wondering, and it might be a question from some of the people that are watching, what kinds of advice would you give for individuals who are interested in starting a human rights committee? What are some best practices or things that you advise individuals and groups to do?
I think, looking at how things have been and what I've described in this session, I think it starts with what actually is happening now in our community across the country, and that is beginning to share stories. Initially, I just have to give an example that in 2009, we had a gathering in Vancouver, which was called Honoring Our People. And at that gathering, many Nisei people came. But before it got going, we were given advice by some community members not to do it. And not to do it because it would cause too much pain to remember the internment. But we did go ahead. And what happened was that there was a great kind of a unity among people who came, who really wanted to share their stories of what happened in their families. And they did. And Satsuki Ina, who I mentioned before, came to that. And she put a context to it of the need for mental health by sharing stories. And so I think in local communities, it's really important to get together, to have perhaps these circles, which again, Satsuki has been training people to host sharing circles and to share those stories. And then there's a sort of an understanding possibly between what hurts and what traumas that have happened to us as individuals are things to be shared. And then I think once that's understood, there's an empathy that can develop towards other communities. And I think that those things are actually happening now. But I do think that things start from our own selves. Initially, I have to say this too, that the NAJC was amazingly strong in sort of doing the frameworking to establish human rights in the national organization. But there's a difference between presenting the framework and having actual people to take it up and to take it on and to own it themselves. And I think that was part of the reason why there was a bit of a slow start to really looking at human rights committee development across the country. But now, with the story sharing and the younger generations, everything seems at this point to me to be really coming together.
So for those members who don't know, we label our generations Issei, which is the first generation that come immediately from Japan. Nisei are the second generation who were born in Canada with parents or relatives from Japan, and then we have the Sansei, who are third generation. I also wanted to mention, which Judy hasn't mentioned yet, is the fact that part of the redress settlement helped establish the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. So I just want to mention those couple things, and I'm seeing a couple of questions and comments within the chat. So one of the comments is, during my time working abroad as a young adult from a white settler background, I got asked the question, where are you really from? Which is a question we get asked a lot, right, Judy? We can identify with that because I did not have the right skin tone and eye color. I thought this was not very nice and said to myself, I would not do this in Canada. After this incident, I tried not to ask this type of question. And it's interesting because that's been an ongoing question. I'm an immigrant to Canada. I'm a first generation, and I get that asked all the time. And it's a weird question because I've gone through a couple of different countries to get to Canada. And I think a lot of refugees and immigrants often end up coming through different countries, and oftentimes they want to say they're from Canada. So Maria continues to say that, but as you said, we as Canadians have asked this question for a very long time, and it's very hurtful. I think that it's interesting because I think that anyone who is not what most people think of as white Canadian will be asked, so where are you from? And sometimes it's done as a curiosity, and sometimes it's done intentionally. And so I know that that's an ongoing question. I have another question for you, Judy. One of the issues that human rights committees and human rights individuals who are working in the field are constantly asked about is around the political pieces of human rights. And I know that one, and I'm just going to use one of the ones that recently came up in our local community, is dealing with the war in the Middle East.
Yes.
And taking a stance on that. And so I guess I would ask your comments around that as a human rights committee.
Yeah, and this did come up so that the NAJC did submit a letter to government urging for the ceasefire and urging for humanitarian corridors to be implemented and to the release of all the hostages. This was something that was initiated through the NAJC Human Rights Committee and then forwarded to the board and then passed through the board to be something to be communicated to the Prime Minister and so on. But in that letter, there was also a reference to dealing with the hate that was happening here. And because of our history of as being innocent people who were labeled and hated and vilified, we could see the connection to the current situation. And so we put the message out that for all people who are experiencing this within the Arab community, within the Jewish community, within the Palestinian community, and other Middle Eastern ancestry people, that there needed to be an end. There needed to be a strong measure by Canada to make sure that there was something effective done to end the hate and the threats and the violence that was being perpetrated. So that has been the position of the NAJC Human Rights Committee.
Well, it was interesting during the panel yesterday with Art Miki and with Merritt Amatsu, and I asked the question about taking on the fight for redress, and it was interesting to hear Art Miki say, "Yeah, you just do it because it's the right thing to do." And it's always an interesting comment is that you do it because you want to support others who are going through the same thing. And I know that the Japanese Association, many of the members have continued to work for the fight for other groups when they need partners who will stand with them. And so I think that's one of the biggest messages I've heard from not only the NAJC Human Rights Committees, but from a lot of individuals doing this work is we need to stand together and support each other. So at this time, I don't see any more questions. Maria does ask, which is kind of interesting, a follow-up about the question of where you're from a human rights perspective. Is it better to be curious and ask about culture?
I think it is. I think it is. Whenever something's being asked simply out of curiosity and not out of an assumption, I think it's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. I think as a racialized person, I've certainly been assumed not to have been born in Canada. And it's that awareness that does create challenges for racialized people. So when the question is asked, there is initially, for me anyway, a kind of okay, now where is this going kind of response internally. But I will want to know where that question is coming from. And if I sense that it's purely out of curiosity, because, we know that as settler people here, that we've all originated from somewhere else. So I do get engaged a little bit personally in that kind of an experience. And I do think that if I get a sense that this person is speaking from an attitude of, well, you don't really belong here, like, why are you here? Then I will disengage. I will say that's enough. That's it. I'm leaving. So there you go.
So do you have any final words around human rights and practicing human rights, not only within an NAJC, but in your own community? Because I know you're quite active in the British Columbia local community, especially with the Greater Vancouver area.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice or any lasting comments for the individuals? Because it's a hard fight doing human rights every day. So any words of encouragement or any final comments about human rights work?
Well, I think I've said a lot during this session. And when we were developing the PowerPoint, we ended with the picture of the three little girls. And, I think that's the kind of thing that we're all striving to have is a country and people and a society which creates that safety for everybody, where nobody has to justify who they are. And so I think what happens is if you're oriented that way, and I think many of us are, more and more of us, I believe, then this human rights sort of value that you hold is something that just is with you. So it is on an organizational level. I think the NAJC has done a lot to structure a framework for making sure that human rights is at the forefront. And in that kind of organizational process, there's work to do. There's continuing organizational work and looking at what can be developed and what can be created to make sure that the national community and other communities that we can partner with can know and work together. So that's work. That is work organizationally. I think what inspires it is this inner value system that we all hold, that we believe in being anti-racist. We believe we have to fight, and we believe that we have to stand up when there is an injustice being committed upon other people. Sometimes there's a fragility in this too, because when a community has been mistreated and they've suffered inhumanities, as we have, as you know, being model minority has been one of the strategies to get over that, to get through that. And our families, our communities have really focused on that kind of a process to make sure that we're moving ahead and we're showing how Canadian we are. Those are things that are worthy, but they're not the only thing. And as I said, underneath that, there still needs to be this sense that racism is wrong. You have to stand up. You have to make a world that's based on other forms of human connection. And as the Indigenous people say, the phrase "all my relations" is extremely meaningful, because it means that we are related. It means that human beings are related to their Mother Earth, to everything around us. And certainly that's something that I completely value personally myself. And I think that it is something that does keep us going. And I know that I share that with other people who have done the work and are keeping on doing it, including you, Hitomi. So, we know what we are.
Yes. I've noticed a couple of comments and questions in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you the first one. It says, when I arrived here, I was asked if I came from China. I felt it quite interesting because I did not know why he saw Chinese in me. Then I was told by another person that this question is racist. I'm quite confused about this issue.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment, because that's a kind of ambiguous thing that often happens to people. And my instinct would say that it was a question based on a person who possibly was othering somebody. It's hard to say. It's confusing. It is part of the reality that we have to stand up and call it what it is when it is in front of us. And it is confusing. Stand your ground, though, because if somebody's showing something that indicates that they're othering you, stand your ground. Be safe and stand your ground. Make sure that they know that what they're saying, what they're implying is wrong. So, yeah.
We have another individual that's asked some interesting questions. Wonderful discussion. Thank you. I'm curious what your community and organization would ideally see the role of white allies to use privilege and power in the best way to amplify your work. And so, too, if you have comments on ways we aren't helping or making missteps. And so this is a lovely question, because allies and those who are not of the group are we're often asked this. And so it'll be interesting to see what Judy has to say about it.
Well, I do have things that I think about this, and it's always good to have allies. I think what I see needing to happen within the majority and mostly white community is a sense of self-consciousness, and not something that needs to be defended, but also in looking at racialized communities speaking up and saying that what has happened to them is wrong. There's often something that has developed within the majority called white guilt. And that's something that I think needs to be explored more fully. I think the majority people, white people, do need to look at what's going on for them, because systemic racism is so embedded in this country that sometimes what is looked upon as being just the way it is actually something that shouldn't be the way it is. And the difference, I think, has been experienced by racialized and othered people of discrimination. And then the majority not recognizing a certain law or a certain tradition as being something that is not right. That is a violation. And these kinds of things need to get really examined within the majority to know and to explore that, not be afraid to explore that themselves, looking internally. We do need allies. Everybody, a society that's based on allyship among all people is, of course, what we all idealize. But I think within the majority, there needs to be that work as well, and not just looking on at the energy taken up by racialized communities to stand against racism. There needs to be a real look inside as well. And there are experts in there, in society, in various places, who understand that kind of work within the white majority. And they're available to do workshops for that purpose. So I would say take that on.
Also, there are some other sessions that I would suggest that you turn to with respect to some of this ally work. And I would encourage you to ensure that you look at our program, because we have a wide range of programs available within the conference here to provide some of the background information for this. But I'm going to take one more question here, because I think it's a great question, Judy. The question here is how immigrants know if they're experiencing subtle racism, and who makes the standard of racism. So, yeah, tough question there.
Yeah, it is a tough question. And yet, in some ways, you know, the ways that recently immigrated people, or people waiting for their permanent residency and so on, have expressed to me, actually, there may be subtleties, but there's also very overt situations that they do encounter. One of them, of course, is if you speak English with an accent. It's true, as the film indicated, people who have had that experience have felt the kind of the response they get, which is that the person they're talking to treats them as if they're not intelligent, or that they have to speak louder because they have to tell this person who doesn't understand English very well, you know, what the information is. Also, there's a systemic situation that I've been told by some immigrant Japanese people, is that as you're going through the process of applying for citizenship, there's a great fear that you do anything wrong, you get a traffic ticket, you become known to government, then there's a fear that they're going to criticize and they'll find some fault in your presence here, and that your jeopardy, your standing as being able to remain in Canada is at risk. And this is real. This is real stuff that happens to immigrant community members. The racism happens, again, as with all of us, based on color, being racialized. It happens to immigrants, community members as well. But the subtleties are not so subtle in my view, really. They're not so subtle. And perhaps in social situations there may be something that is experienced. But again, I'm feeling that racialized immigrant community members have that instinct to kind of know when there's some othering happening to them. And I stand with them because it is difficult to go through the process of becoming Canadian. Even the government requirements to do it are quite daunting, and I really appreciate that they're facing quite a challenge, and I'm supporting them and being able to move through it, and they do. So,
well, I'm going to say, as an immigrant, having taken that process, there's probably most immigrants know more about Canada and have had to work more around the rules within Canadian bureaucracy in order to become citizens. Right. And I applaud anyone who goes through that process, because it's a tough
process.
Yes. Speaking of the process, my session was moved to 4:30 this afternoon with respect to citizenship. And I'll be talking a little bit about citizenship and the rights that we do and don't hold and how it's revoked. But I would encourage everyone to take advantage of the additional sessions. We are coming to a close here, and I just want to acknowledge that we've had help from Halima and Ronak and Kevin in the background, as well as Ed and Jessica. Their help has been invaluable in order to be able to get Judy to give her presentation and run all of the audio and all of the things. And we would encourage everyone to take advantage of the replay sections, because the replay sections will allow you to visit the sessions that you haven't been able to see, because they're all being recorded. And we, once again, as the National Association of Japanese Canadians in the Edmonton Japanese community, want to thank the John Humphrey Center for being allowed to share our stories and our best practices with the members that are attending. And we want to welcome you to additional sessions. It is 1:37 and the next session start at 2. So everyone has some time to have a little bit of a break, and we'll see you at the next session at 2 o'clock. Thank you for attending.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. It was a great session. Thank you.